The rite of standing began at the 6th hour of the celestial axis's diurnal cycle and would end at the 12th. Because the Cavithry approach to ceremonial events operated on the principle that if a ritual was worth conducting, it was worth conducting at a length that tested the endurance of everyone involved, including the person conducting it. This was not accidental. The rite was explicitly designed as an ordeal. The empress's willingness to walk for 6 hours demonstrated sovereign commitment. The formation's ability to stand for 6 hours demonstrated martial dedication. And the court's capacity to observe for 6 hours demonstrated either political loyalty or the survival instinct to remain visible during events the empress considered important, which in practical terms amounted to the same thing. The Hall of Eternal Vigil was built for this purpose and no other. It stretched the length of the celestial axis's central spine, nearly 3 kilometers of polished black stone and crystalline columns that generated the hall's illumination through a bioluminescent reaction triggered by the presence of biological organisms, which meant the hall literally came alive when people entered it and went dark when they left. A design feature that the architects had intended as a metaphor for the relationship between sovereign and state, and that the maintenance staff considered an ongoing inconvenience, because cleaning an empty hall in complete darkness required portable lighting and a tolerance for philosophical irony. The formation filled the hall's central avenue. Thousands of warriors arranged in species-designated blocks, each block organized by rank and function, the entire arrangement forming a corridor through which the empress would walk at a pace calibrated to allow observation of every individual present. The Cavithry Imperial Guard occupied the formation's first and largest block, 700 warriors in ceremonial armor that was functional rather than decorative, because the Cavithry did not recognize a distinction between the two. Their armor was dark, angular, designed to enhance the already formidable silhouettes of a species whose genetic enhancement programs had produced warriors averaging 6'4" with dense musculature and sensory architecture that operated at 3 times human baseline. The allied species blocks occupied the formation's far end, arranged in order of coalition seniority: Moltari thermal infantry, Selvari border assault troops, Kalashin trade guard. And at the very end, the human delegation, 4 security officers assigned to the coalition liaison office, positioned last because humanity was the most recent coalition addition and protocol placed newcomers at the greatest distance from the sovereign, which was either a reflection of hierarchical ranking or a safety measure that no one would officially confirm. Corporal James Hale stood at the end of the end. Last block, last row, last position, the mathematical terminus of the entire formation, the point at which the empress's procession would conclude before she turned and retraced her path. He occupied this position with the equanimity of a man who understood that rank determined placement, and that his rank, in the context of a galactic military coalition, was approximately equivalent to the rank of a single brick in a very large building, structurally present, but unlikely to draw architectural attention. He was 27. He was 5'11", which made him average among humans and notably undersized among the Cavithry warriors, whose genetically enhanced frames dominated the formation's forward blocks. His build was lean, disciplined, carrying the compact musculature of a soldier whose fitness was functional rather than ornamental, maintained through routine and requirement rather than pursuit of physical impression. His face was what his former drill sergeant had described, with the creative vocabulary that British military NCOs brought to personnel assessment, as unremarkable but serviceable, which James had accepted as a compliment because, in the household division, unremarkable was a professional asset. Ceremonial guards were not meant to be individually noticed. They were meant to be collectively present, identical, immovable, a wall of disciplined stillness that communicated institutional permanence through the medium of human beings who had been trained to resemble institutional permanence as closely as biology would allow. His hair was dark, cut to military regulation, invisible beneath the ceremonial headgear that the human delegation wore for coalition events. His eyes were hazel, green-brown, steady, focused on a point in the middle distance that was not a specific object but a practiced focal anchor, the visual equivalent of a held note that ceremonial guards used to maintain the fixed-gaze discipline that prevented the natural impulse to track movement, assess stimulus, or acknowledge the existence of anything occurring outside their designated field of attention. He was standing at attention, not the approximate attention that most military traditions produced, the general uprightness, the roughly aligned posture, the adequate stillness that satisfied inspection at a distance. He was standing at the attention that 18 months of household division ceremonial drill training had burned into his neuromuscular system with the methodical, uncompromising thoroughness of an institution that had been perfecting this specific skill for centuries, and that considered anything less than absolute mastery a personal insult to the regiment, the crown, and the fundamental concept of standing up properly. The empress entered the hall at the 6th hour precisely, because Salith vor Kithrin had been punctual for 219 years, and considered tardiness a character flaw that no amount of sovereign authority could excuse. She walked with the measured pace that the rite prescribed, steady, unhurried, approximately 1 meter per second, a speed that allowed detailed observation while maintaining forward progression, and that required approximately 50 minutes per kilometer, meaning the full 3-kilometer walk would consume 2.5 hours in each direction, with the remaining hour distributed across the turning points, the ceremonial addresses at each species block's head, and the brief sovereign rest period that protocol provided, and that Salith had never once used because resting during a ceremony designed to test endurance would communicate a message she was not willing to send. She was 243 years old. She looked, by human estimation, approximately 40. The Cavithry aging process was not linear but logarithmic, producing rapid maturation followed by centuries of sustained physical prime before a relatively brief decline that the Cavithry regarded as a final campaign rather than a deterioration. She was tall, 6'2", with the proportions that Cavithry sovereign lineage produced through centuries of genetic curation, long-limbed, precise, carrying the specific ratio of height to shoulder width that Cavithry aesthetics associated with authority. Her skin was pale silver blue, darker along the cheekbones and the ridges of her brow, carrying the luminous depth that indicated imperial bloodline. Her eyes were deep violet, almost black, with the enhanced pupil architecture that gave Cavithry vision its famous acuity. She could resolve detail at distances that human vision rendered into blur, and her perception of movement operated at a temporal resolution that made her effectively impossible to surprise. Along her temples and tracing the line of her jaw, bioluminescent patterns shifted in the slow, controlled rhythms of sovereign composure, deep indigo, steady silver, the chromatic baseline of an empress conducting official business. She walked the Cavithry block. 700 warriors observed, assessed, their micro-movements catalogued by her enhanced perception. The weight shifts, the postural adjustments, the involuntary muscular recalibrations that biological systems produced during sustained stillness. Her own guard was impressive. They were the product of 8 centuries of genetic optimization, trained in combat techniques that made them individually capable of engaging most species' entire squads, and their ceremonial discipline was the best the Cavithry had ever produced. They shifted, on average, once every 4 minutes, small movements, invisible to standard observation, but visible to her, because her perception was designed to detect exactly this kind of detail, and because the rite of standing was, at its core, an exercise in her ability to see what others could not. She walked the allied blocks. Moltari, whose thermal-adapted physiology produced visible heat shimmer during extended stillness. Selvari, whose combat-optimized reflexes made holding a static position actively uncomfortable. Kalashin, whose trade guard maintained adequate formation discipline through cultural training rather than military rigor. She reached the human block at hour 2. 4 security officers, positioned at the formation's mathematical end, wearing the coalition dress uniform that human forces had adopted for Allied ceremonial duties. 3 of the 4 exhibited the standard range of human micro-movements, weight shifts at irregular intervals, minor postural corrections, the small adjustments that human physiology required during sustained standing. The 4th exhibited nothing. Salith's perception, 2 centuries of trained observation operating through genetically enhanced sensory architecture, locked onto the discrepancy with the automated focus of a system detecting an anomaly. The 4th human was not shifting, was not adjusting, was not producing any of the micro-movements that every other biological organism in the formation, including her own elite guard, was exhibiting. He was still in a way that her perception could not classify because it did not match any pattern in her observational library. Not the stillness of exhaustion which produced rigidity, not the stillness of effort which produced tremor, not the stillness of death, which produced the particular quality of absence that living systems did not replicate. He was still the way a mountain was still, not through effort but through state, as though motionlessness was not something he was doing but something he was, a condition rather than an achievement, and the condition was so thorough that her enhanced perception, scanning for the involuntary betrayals that biology always produced, found nothing to report. Salith stopped. The formation did not react, because the formation was trained not to react, but the court galleries above reacted with the specific, suppressed intensity of people watching something unprecedented happen in real time and lacking any protocol for processing it. 219 rites of standing. The empress had never stopped. The continuous forward movement was not merely tradition but theological statement. The sovereign's unbroken progression through the formation represented the Cavithry concept of eternal assessment. The monarch's gaze as a river that flowed without interruption, and stopping that flow concentrated the sovereign's full attention on a single individual, with an intensity that the right symbology treated as something between promotion and judgment. The imperial guard commander, standing at the formation's head 3 kilometers away, received the report through his communication implant and processed it with the internal composure of a man whose professional dignity was being tested by the information that his empress had stopped before the last soldier in the last block of the Allied section. The last soldier, the one positioned at the greatest possible distance from sovereign attention, the one who, by every metric of protocol and precedent, should have been observed with a fraction of a glance during the procession's terminal phase and forgotten before the empress completed her turn. Salith stood before James Hale and studied him with the focused acuity of someone whose perception operated at a resolution that could count the threads in his uniform's weave and detect the pulse in his carotid artery, and map the distribution of weight across his feet with millimeter precision. She found what she was looking for, which was nothing, no shifts, no corrections, no involuntary tremors, no biological betrayals of any kind. His breathing was controlled to a rate so steady it produced no visible chest movement. His weight distribution was mathematically balanced, centered with a precision that suggested not balance but the deliberate, trained elimination of imbalance. His eyes were fixed on their focal anchor with a gaze discipline that did not waver when the empress of the Cavithry Dominion stopped 2 meters in front of him, which meant either his peripheral awareness had failed to register her presence, unlikely, given that she was directly in his forward field, or his discipline was sufficient to override the instinct to acknowledge a sovereign's proximity, which was either insulting or extraordinary, and which his fixed expression did not clarify. How do you maintain such perfect stillness? she asked. Her voice carried the harmonic resonance of Cavithry speech, and the translation systems embedded in the hall's infrastructure rendered her question in English with the precision of technology designed for exactly this kind of interspecies communication. The question reached James through his earpiece, and his response was produced without any of the physical changes that answering a question typically generated. No shift in posture, no turn of the head, no adjustment of focus. His mouth moved and everything else remained exactly as it had been, as though speech were an independent function that his body performed without consulting or disturbing any of its other ongoing operations. Ma'am, on Earth, royal guards at certain posts are trained to stand motionless for 6-hour shifts as demonstration of absolute commitment. This is hour 2. The silence that followed was not the silence of a room waiting for something to happen. It was the silence of a room recalibrating its understanding of what was happening. The court galleries, where hundreds of advisors and officials had been observing the rite with the professional attentiveness of people whose careers required them to interpret sovereign behavior, processed the empress's question, and the human's response with the collective cognitive effort of an institution encountering a data point that did not fit its existing models. Salith's bioluminescent patterns shifted, the deep indigo of sovereign composure lightened by a degree that her court had not seen during any previous rite, a shift toward the brighter violet that indicated heightened cognitive engagement, the chromatic signature of an empress whose interest had been activated at a level above ceremonial routine. 6 hours, she repeated. Your species trains warriors to stand motionless for 6 hours. Not warriors specifically, ma'am, ceremonial guards. The skill set is distinct. Explain the distinction. Warriors are trained to act. Ceremonial guards are trained to not act. The discipline is different in kind, not degree. A warrior controls what they do. A ceremonial guard controls what they don't do. Every impulse to shift, adjust, respond, those impulses don't stop. The training doesn't eliminate them. It provides the tools to choose each time not to obey them. Salith's violet bioluminescence deepened. Her enhanced perception was operating at full resolution now, scanning the human for the physiological evidence of what he was describing. The impulses he claimed were present but overridden, and finding, beneath the external stillness, the subtle internal signatures of a biological system that was indeed working, actively and continuously, to maintain the state it presented. His heart rate was controlled but not resting, elevated slightly above baseline, indicating sustained muscular engagement. His core temperature was fractionally higher than ambient comfort, consistent with the metabolic cost of isometric muscle activation. He was not relaxed. He was working. Every second, every moment, he was choosing stillness over the movement his body was requesting, and the choosing was continuous, and the continuity was the discipline. Your imperial guard, James said, and the observation emerged with the matter-of-fact precision of a soldier answering questions, not volunteering opinions, but answering thoroughly because thoroughness was how the household division handled superior officers' inquiries. Shifts approximately once every 4 minutes. Average across the formation, excellent by most standards. And your standard? 0 shifts, full duration. That's the expectation, ma'am. The expectation, not the achievement. The achievement follows the expectation, given sufficient training and motivation. Salith remained before his position for 17 minutes. 17 minutes during which the rite of standing, an ancient and immutable ceremony, was effectively suspended, while the Empress of the Cavithry Dominion conducted a conversation with a human corporal about the philosophy of standing still. The court advisors in the galleries above cycled through emotional states that their bioluminescent patterns tracked in real time for anyone who cared to observe. Confusion, concern, alarm, and eventually, a grudging fascination as they recognized that their empress was not breaking protocol casually, but breaking it with the focused intention of someone who had found something worth the breakage. She asked him about the training. He told her about the household division, the selection, the 18 months of drill, the progressive extension of motionless duration from minutes to hours, the techniques that converted agony into manageable discomfort and manageable discomfort into neutral background noise that the trained mind observed without obeying. He told her about the philosophy that underpinned it. That ceremonial duty was not lesser service but the purest expression of military discipline, because it stripped away every external validator. No enemy to fight, no objective to achieve, no crisis to resolve, and reduced the soldier's function to its most fundamental element, which was the willingness to remain where placed, doing what ordered for however long required, without complaint, without deviation, and without the reward of visible purpose. Your species does this voluntarily, Salith said, and the harmonic undertone of her voice had shifted into a register that her attendants recognized as genuine intellectual engagement. A frequency the Empress used for ideas that interested her at the deepest level, and that she had not directed at another being during a right of standing in the entirety of her reign. Voluntarily, ma'am, the guards volunteer. The training is voluntary. The service is considered an honor. An honor, the word sat in the air between them. Among my people, stillness is a limitation. Our genetic enhancements optimize for action, speed, strength, sensory response. Standing motionless is something our biology resists because our enhancement architecture was designed to resist it. Stillness, for a Cavathri warrior, is the failure state between engagements. With respect, ma'am, stillness isn't a failure state. It's a readiness state. The difference between a weapon at rest and a weapon that's been decommissioned is that the weapon at rest can be fired instantly. A guard standing still isn't inactive. He's fully activated and choosing not to discharge. The bioluminescent patterns along Salith's temples flared, a pulse of bright silver violet that her court had never seen during a rite, and that the chromatic lexicon would identify, after considerable scholarly debate, as the sovereign equivalent of being intellectually struck. Not challenged, not contradicted, struck, the experience of encountering a concept so precisely articulated that it reorganized assumptions she had held for decades. She looked at the human, who was 4,000 ranks below the threshold of appropriate conversation, and who had just, while standing at attention in the last position of the last block of the least significant section of the formation, delivered a philosophical observation about the nature of martial discipline that none of her advisors, strategists, or guard commanders had ever expressed, because they had been raised in a culture that measured discipline through action, and had never considered that the absence of action might be its most demanding form. The rite resumed. Salith completed her procession. But the conversation had changed something, not in the ceremony's structure, which continued according to its ancient protocols, but in the empress who conducted it, who walked the remaining distance back to the hall's origin with bioluminescent patterns that her court read and could not interpret, because the colors moving through the sovereign's chromatic display were new, and new colors from a 219-year empress were unprecedented enough to generate 3 separate advisory memoranda before the rite concluded. The announcement came the following morning. Imperial decree, delivered through the formal channels that Cavathri constitutional law required for appointments to sovereign household positions, signed by the Empress in the luminescent ink that the tradition reserved for decisions the monarch considered personally significant. Corporal James Hale, United Earth Diplomatic Protection Service, was appointed to the position of sovereign's personal sentinel, the single warrior posting stationed at the entrance to the Empress's private chambers, a position that had existed for 12 centuries and that had been held, without exception, by the most elite Cavathri warrior available. The position was not primarily protective. The Cavathri Guard provided comprehensive security through layered systems that did not depend on any single individual. The position was symbolic. The sentinel at the sovereign's door represented the dominion's martial philosophy made physical, a living statement of what the empire valued in its warriors. For 12 centuries, that statement had been strength, speed, lethality, the qualities that Cavithry genetic enhancement produced and that their military tradition celebrated. Salith's appointment changed the statement. The qualities the sentinel now embodied were different. Discipline, stillness, the capacity to master the body's demands through training and will rather than modification, and the philosophical truth that the human had articulated in the Hall of Eternal Vigil. That readiness was not the opposite of stillness but its highest expression. The Imperial Guard commander received the decree and processed it with the professional composure of a career officer who had just watched his most prestigious posting. The position his warriors competed for across decades of service, awarded to a foreign corporal who had earned it by standing still. His composure held. It held because he was a Cavithry warrior, and Cavithry warriors processed difficult information without external display. It held for 2 hours and 47 minutes, which was, he reflected later, considerably longer than the human managed to stand motionless, and which provided a bitter and instructive consolation. James Hale stood his first watch as the sovereign's personal sentinel at the entrance to the empress's private chambers on the celestial axis. In the posture he had learned during 18 months of training at Wellington Barracks under the supervision of drill sergeants whose professional standards were, by any reasonable assessment, the universe's most demanding, and whose vocabulary for expressing dissatisfaction with a guardsman's posture could strip paint at 20 paces. He stood in the dress uniform that the human diplomatic service had provided for the posting, modified at the Empress's request to include the sentinel's ceremonial sash, a strip of dark crystalline fabric that carried the weight of 12 centuries of tradition, and that rested across his chest with the particular heaviness of things that mean more than their material composition suggests. The court passed. Cavithry officials, advisors, military officers. They walked the corridor outside the Empress's chambers, and they saw the human standing at the door, and their responses varied across the full spectrum of institutional reaction. From outrage through confusion to the grudging, reluctant acknowledgement that the Empress had made a point they could not argue with because the point was standing in front of them, making it with perfect, absolute, unbroken stillness. And arguing with it would require first surpassing it, which none of them could do. On the third day, Salith stopped at the sentinel's post during her evening return. She did not stop because protocol required it. The Empress did not acknowledge the sentinel during routine passage, just as the sovereign did not acknowledge the door the sentinel guarded or the walls that held the door. The sentinel was architecture. That was the tradition. The Empress acknowledged architecture by using it, not by addressing it. She stopped because she wanted to, and because 219 years of sovereignty had earned her the right to stop where she chose, and because the human standing at her door was doing something that no one in her civilization could do, and that she found, after 2 centuries of reviewing the greatest warriors her species could produce, more compelling than anything they had ever shown her. "Hour 4, she asked. "Hour 4, ma'am." "Is it difficult?" "Yes, ma'am. Yet you remain." "That's the point, ma'am." The bioluminescent patterns along Salith's temples shifted, a warm pulse of silver violet that her attendants, watching from a respectful distance, recognized from the right, and that they were beginning to understand was not an anomaly but a response, specific and recurring, to this particular human and what he represented. She studied his face, the unremarkable features held in their trained neutrality, the hazel eyes fixed on their focal anchor, the absolute absence of movement that she now understood was not absence at all, but the most intensive form of presence she had ever witnessed. "My guard commander informed me this morning," she said, "that he intends to incorporate stillness training into the Imperial Guard's regiment. He considers it a deficiency in their preparation that your appointment has made visible." With respect, ma'am, it will be difficult for them. Their enhancement architecture is optimized against it. The discomfort will be considerable. He is aware. He has also informed me that if a human without genetic enhancement can achieve this standard, his enhanced warriors will achieve it, or he will know the reason why. The faintest shift in her expression, not quite a smile, Cavithry facial architecture, did not produce smiles in the human configuration, but a softening at the edges of her violet eyes that communicated something in the same emotional territory. You have caused a considerable disruption to my military establishment, corporal. I apologize, ma'am. Do not, disruption of complacency is a service, and you are performing it admirably. She paused by standing still. The corridor was quiet. The celestial axis hummed its ambient frequencies, the deep, constant resonance of a station that had been home to sovereign power for centuries, and that absorbed the footsteps and conversations and small dramas of daily governance into its structure the way old buildings absorbed weather. Salith looked at the human at her door, the soldier who had earned the most prestigious posting in her empire by mastering the discipline her warriors had never thought to practice. And the warm silver violet of her bioluminescent patterns held steady, and the steadiness itself was a kind of stillness. And the stillness was, she was beginning to understand, a kind of strength. She entered her chambers, the door closed, and James Hale, Sovereign's personal sentinel, formerly of the household division and currently the most controversial military appointment in Cavithry imperial history, remained at his post in the silence of the corridor, absolutely still, because that was his duty, and his duty was not to move, and moving was not what he did. And the not doing was the most demanding thing he had ever done and would continue to do, hour after hour, shift after shift. In the particular, punishing, extraordinary discipline of a man who had learned that the hardest thing in the universe was not fighting but choosing, moment by moment, not to, and doing it so